YouTube, and welcome to the third and final part of making these sheepskin boots. In the first video we made the pattern, in the second video we prepared all the leather for sewing, and now it's time to stitch it all together. As I mentioned earlier in the series, there was a lot of trial and error involved since this is my first time making boots, and I did have to make some adjustments to the cuff. I made my adjustments after my pieces were stitched together, but if you want to make the same adjustments, do it before stitching it together. It will just make your life easier. I used a selection of needles for this, and I used either a short or a curved needle for getting into the tricky places. And I used this wax cotton thread in a light brown. I begin by stitching the inner and outer soles together. I'm using about 2 arm spans of thread, and I've threaded a needle on each end. You can start anywhere. I'm just starting at the front. I push a needle through one of the holes. I then line up the bottoms of both needles and I pull the thread through until the centre of the thread is coming through the hole. I then move on to the next hole, pulling the needle through. I then come up with the other needle through the same hole. And I pull both the threads tight. I move on to the next stitch, coming down with one needle, and coming up through the same hole with the second needle and pulling the threads tight. Down the next hole with one needle, up through the same hole with the second needle, and pull the threads tight. This is called a saddle stitch, and I continue working this way all around the sole until I come back to the beginning. And when I come back around, I do the final stitch, and then I go over the first few stitches again. This can be a bit tight, so I use pliers to help me. When I've gone over a few stitches, I bring both threads through to the inside. I then make a surgeon's knot by looping one thread under the other twice and pulling it tight. I then bring each thread under the next stitch, and I can snip off the tails. And now the soles are complete. Now it's time to stitch the top of the boot to the sole, and I'll be beginning with the centre front. I've taken about 2 arm span of thread and I threaded each end onto a needle. I locate my centre front notch and I can see that I have a hole punched on either side. From the inside out I come up through one of the holes, and with my other needle I come up through the hole next to it. I then line up the bottoms of the needles and pull the thread through until the centre of the thread is pulled against the leather. I then find the centre front notch on my sole and I insert my needles from the outside in so that the threads cross over. I pull the threads tight and I make sure that the sole sits on top of the boot front. I come back up through one of the stitches in the boot front. I come down through the next stitch in the sole and up through the next stitch in the boot front and pull the thread through. I then cross over the thread, coming back down through that last stitch in the sole and back up through the same stitch in the boot front. Pull the thread tight and make sure the sole stays on top of the boot front. I carry on making cross stitches along the boot front, pulling the stitches tight as I go and keeping the sole piece on top. Now that I've done a few stitches along the front, I'm going to pick up my other needle and start stitching along the other side. I bring the needle up through the last stitch in the boot front. I carry on making cross stitches and pulling the stitches tight as I go. And when I've done a few stitches on this side, I swap needles again and start working in the other direction. Okay, I appear to have lost a lot of footage of me stitching the toe, Basically what I did was I'd work a few stitches in each needle, working from side to side. Just made it easier to work the stitches as the toe closed. And I kept going until I got to a point where I needed to add more thread. I'm starting to run out of thread, so I'm going to tie this one off and add some more. I come up through the sole layer as though I'm about to start another cross stitch. And then I tie a knot, putting my needle through the loop twice. I pull it tight. I then bring my needle underneath a few stitches and pull it through so that the knot is in between two layers of leather and underneath the stitches. I snip that off and I'm ready to add another thread. I threaded my needle with an arm span of thread and tied a knot in the end. I sew under the stitches on the inside of the boot and come up through a hole a few stitches in. I then go back over those last couple of cross stitches to reinforce the area where the threads join. I then carry on making cross stitches until I have 2 stitch holes left on the boot front. And with 2 stitches left, I'm ready to add the boot side. I come up through the sole and boot front, ready to do another cross stitch, and then I come up through the first hole in the boot side piece. I keep this piece on top of the boot front and underneath the sole, and I come back through the last stitch, coming up through all the layers, completing the cross stitch. I start the next stitch, coming up through the sole, through the last hole in the boot front, up through the second hole in the boot side, keeping those 2 pieces on top of each other and underneath the sole, and complete the cross stitch, coming up through all the layers. And now that those 2 pieces are joined together, I can carry on making cross stitches along the boot side, joining it to the sole. I do this on the other side, and I continue alternating from side to side until I come close to the back of the boot. And as I reach the back of the boot, I can check to make sure my stitches line up. I have 4 stitches on one boot side and 4 stitches on the other, and the last 2 stitches on each side will overlap, so that gives me 6 stitches. I check on the sole and I also have 6 stitches, so it lines up perfectly. The number of stitch holes I had on the sole and the top of the boot worked out exactly the same, but it may be that yours might be 1 or 2 stitches different. If there's anything more than that, then something's gone horribly wrong and you may have to unpick things to have a look. But if there is a stitch or 2 in difference, skip a stitch where there's an extra hole. I've made a little example here. So you can see on the bottom all the cross stitches are right next to each other, whereas at the top, where I made an extra stitch, there's a little gap. That's something you can do to pull the stitches together, and it's barely noticeable, especially when it's down at the bottom of your feet. I carry on making my cross stitches until I have 2 stitches left on one side. Then when I come to the penultimate stitch, I begin my cross stitch by coming through the sole and that second to last stitch. I then pick up the final stitch on the other side, and I complete the cross stitch, making sure to come through all the layers, joining the 2 sides together. I move along to the next stitch, picking up the final stitch on the first side and the second stitch on the next side, and complete the cross stitch. I then bring that thread through to the inside of the boot. I complete my cross stitches on the other side. I then come over those last 2 cross stitches on the join, and I bring that thread to the inside of the boot. Here I come under a stitch, and I make a knot, bringing one thread under the other twice. I pull the knot tight. I bring the thread underneath a couple of stitches to tidy the ends, and snip off the tails. It's starting to look like a boot. Next, I'm going to stitch up the sides. I've taken about an arm span of thread and threaded a needle on each end. I find the penultimate stitch hole on the front layer and the final stitch hole on the side layer, and I come up with my first needle on the top row of the cross stitch. I take my second needle and I come up through the last hole in the front layer and a penultimate hole in the side layer, coming out at the top of the cross stitch. I make sure the bottoms of the needles are even, and I pull them both through so that the centre of the thread is pulled to the inside. Then with each thread, I come up to the next stitch, sewing through both layers to the inside. I then cross the threads over, coming back to the outside through those same holes. I then move up to the next stitch, sewing through both layers to the inside. Cross the threads over at the inside, coming back through the tops of those stitches. I continue to work my way up the seam, crossing the threads over at the inside. And when I reach the final stitch hole, I cross the threads over at the inside and cross them over again on the outside. To secure the thread, I work a running stitch down a couple of stitches, coming back to the inside. I tie a knot, looping the threads over each other twice. I then come down through a hole in between the two layers, pull the thread through and snip off the tail. And I repeat that process for the other side. Now it's time to stitch up the back. I have 2 arms span of thread with a needle on each end, and I use the same technique I used for stitching up the sides. I come up through both layers at the top of the cross stitch, making sure the needles are even and pulling the thread through, pulling the centre to the back. I then work my way up the stitches, coming through both layers, crossing the threads over on the inside, and I carry on working up the back until I reach the top. And when I reach the top stitch hole, I cross the threads over on the inside, and I will use the rest of this thread to attach the cuff. I fold the cuff in half, and I make a mark at the bottom in the centre. And there is a stitch hole roughly either side of that mark. At the top of the boot, I cross the threads over on the outside, and I pick up the stitches on either side of the centre mark on the cuff. And working with each thread from the centre outwards, I move on to the next stitch, then back to where I crossed the thread over. I move on 2 more stitches, then back to the last stitch. I work a back stitch along the top until I reach the end. From here I begin to stitch the cuff closed, but I'm not going to show too much of this process since I end up unpicking it all. As I turn the cuff right side out, I can see it hasn't turned out as I had hoped. The stitches and half the seam allowance have been pulled to the outside, giving a very bad and unclean finish. So I come up with plan B. I'm going to tidy up the cuff and make the boot a little taller, with the option to turn the cuff over. But first I unpick all these stitches until my thread is coming out the last hole in the boot side. I then cut away the 1/4 inch seam allowance from the edge of the cuff. I alter my pattern piece by marking 1 inch up from the seam line. I then mark the halfway point across the length of the cuff, and I use a curve to join these 2 marks together. I cut out this new curve and the old seam allowance. I lay my boot out as flat as possible. I place my new pattern piece on top of the old cuff, and I mark out the new cuff line. I brush the fleece downwards and hold it there so that I don't accidentally cut any of it too short, and I cut out the new cuff line. I also trim away the old pen markings since this cuff is now going to be visible. Next I weave in the ends of my threads. I come back through the stitch I'm coming out of, so that the thread loops around the outside. I work a running stitch back through a few stitches until I'm coming out of a stitch on the inside. I then bring my needle underneath a stitch and I tie off the thread, bringing the needle through the loop twice and pulling tight. I come under the next stitch and in between the two layers of leather, and I snip off the tail. I punch a new lace hole at the base of the cuff, and I dye the cuff to match the rest of the boot. Finally, I take a pair of laces. These are 4mm in a light brown with a length of 160 centimeters. I thread them through the lace holes. And my boots are done. Time to try them on. Though I am very happy with the outcome, there are a few minor things I would change. Had I known that I was going to add an extra lace hole and bring up the cuff a little bit, I would have added an extra 1/2 inch to 1 inch to the tongue. It just about sits above the laces, but it would have looked a little better if it was a little higher. If I wasn't too lazy to unpick all the stitches, I could have brought the height of the top of the boot down, punching new holes and stitching the cuff back on. And although these are slouchy boots, I think I still could have brought the back up just a little bit, maybe 1/2 centimetre to 1 centimetre. I make the adjustment on my boot pattern for the next time I make a pair of boots, bringing the heel up by about 1/4 inch. The fit is good, they're very warm and comfortable, and though there were some minor adjustments I could have made for my first pair of boots, I'm very happy with how they came out. And I'm glad I decided to make those adjustments to the cuff, because I think they turned out much better than how I originally envisioned them. I've worn these out a lot during the winter. They're very cosy, and for those of you wondering how the sole is worn, very little. That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this little series of videos. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to hit that like button. You can also follow me on social media at Sandy Creature, and if you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!